Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Freedom Project Media extravaganza. This time it's Shakespeare 400, Death, Remembrance, and Resurrection. This year marks the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, and we're very pleased to bring a unique focus on the great playwright. We're going to look at his life, his career, his writings, his philosophy, his theology, all through the lens of death and remembrance and time. So this is an important day for us. It's an important year. 400 years ago, the bard died in England. It's interesting. Shakespeare was born in 1564, the very year that Michelangelo died in Rome. And Shakespeare died in 1616 within 24 to 48 hours that the great Spanish novelist Cervantes died. And so you've got bookended around Shakespeare's life, the greatest Spanish novelist in history, and you've got the greatest Italian Roman Catholic painter in history. And what ties these great Renaissance artists together? Well, one of the key themes, the key focuses of their art, all three of them, was death. And death, in particular, was the great leveler. Death was the great equalizer among men. And then time was the agent of death. And then ultimately memory, the ability through art to create lasting legacies in poetry and painting and sculpture. That's a kind of immortality. And here we are 400 years, 4 centuries after the death of Shakespeare. He still is the world's most famous playwright, the world's most famous poet. His movies have been adapted there are Lego versions of his movies, there are claymation versions of his movies. His plays have been translated into about 150 different languages, 5 continents his plays have been performed on. The Shakespeare industry is more thriving than it's ever been. And so, looking at Shakespeare from the perspective of death, let's start with a little bit of background, some demographic information to help make sense of all of this. In 1500, England was the most backward country in Europe, and English was the most backward language in Europe. The English spoken in 1500 was pretty crude, it was unrefined. With the exception of Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century, there really hadn't been any outstanding English poetry, any outstanding English art or drama, lasting, enduring art. The language was very, very weak in that regard. The Italian language, the Spanish language, the French language, these other vernacular languages of Europe had produced great art, the Italians and Dante, the French and the troubadour poets. But England was a little bit behind. By the time you get to 1600, right in the wheelhouse of Shakespeare's career, England had become a major metropolitan center, and the city of London had become one of, if not the largest city in all of Europe. The population of London grew by 400% between 1500 and 1600, staggering. But when we look back today, we consider the size of major cities today. London was probably the biggest city in all of Europe, and it had about 150 to 200,000 people, which for us is a relatively small suburb, isn't it? But thinking about what London was before it became so built up, that 150,000 to 200,000 people in 1600 in London lived cramped on top of each other. The London of Shakespeare's heyday contained about 150,000 to 200,000 souls. And here's the interesting thing. Life expectancy for the regularly healthy and the relatively modestly well-off in Shakespeare's day, life expectancy was a total of 42 years. And for those who lived below the poverty line, which was most of Londoners, that was about 25 years you could expect to live. Getting out of infancy was extremely difficult. Shakespeare himself had a number of other brothers and sisters, 2 sisters who died before he was born. And there's only one sibling out of 8 that outlived him. And Shakespeare's own sister Anne died when he was 15 in 1579. So death was a common theme back then. You have a huge population living in very cramped spaces. You have really low life expectancies because childbearing was incredibly difficult. That many people in such a congested area. If you remember pictures and movies of old London, they didn't have wide thoroughfares. They didn't have what we would call 3 or 4 lane traffic. They were usually just cobblestone walks that you could walk through, but you could barely even drive a horse through. Poor hygiene and disease in London in 1600 made London, given the density of the population and how close they were upon each other, one of, if not the most dangerous places to live in the whole history of humankind. That much disease, that much plague, that much vermin. Rats were everywhere. It was customary in Shakespeare's day to put straw mats down on the floor to keep them warm. In the wintertime, put straw down, fresh straw down, to insulate the floor, to give the people something to walk on that was a little softer. But of course, the rats too came into the houses and burrowed into that straw. And as we know, which we'll talk about a little bit more in our next segment, rats, the fleas that were on the backs of rats, the fleas that lived on Indian rats that had migrated to ultimately to Europe, the black rat. These fleas ingested the blood of the rats, and there was a virus in the stomach lining of these rats that poisoned the blood of the rats, didn't kill them. That would be the germ, so to speak, that would cause plague in humans. And when the fleas on the rats buried in the straw hopped off onto the human hosts and bit them, that's how the plague was transmitted. So poor hygiene. They didn't have sewers, they didn't have flush toilets, they didn't have what we would call plumbing in any reasonable sense of the word. The old movies, chamber pots, right? Where people would have usually brass tubs or urns by their bed, and they would literally do their business. They would eliminate waste in both possible ways into this urn, this chamber pot, and they would just oftentimes dump it out the window the next day. The streets themselves were so crowded with not just horse and animal manure, but human feces and manure as well, urine. The Thames River itself was so infested with raw sewage from all of this runoff that it made things like typhus very much a big problem. So low life expectancies because of the sorry state of medicine, because of the inadequate number of doctors, because the poor couldn't afford treatment anyway, because you had people piled upon people, 100,000 people, 200,000 people in what London was in 1600 was a huge cramped space. So poor life expectancies. We're getting at here is that the idea of death was inescapable. Parents knew. I mentioned that Shakespeare's parents, Mary and John. John was a glove maker, a tanner of leather, and he married Mary Arden. And the first two babies they had, two little girls, both died before Shakespeare was born. And again, one of Shakespeare's other sisters, Anne, died in 1579 when he was 15. All of this death, all of this inability to control mortality, the uncertainty of this, made it very, very metaphysical for them. When death was all around you, when your beloved were dying left and right, when life expectancies were so low, the culture had to find some way to deal with this. Give you some more examples of this. The Bubonic Plague, this is the one that we talk about that most people are aware of, the Black Death, as it was called. Now, when we think of the Bubonic Plague, the Black Death, the high era of that would have been the 14th century, right? The 1300s was when the Black Death first visited Europe. And as I mentioned before, the kind of rat that carries this plague virus in its gut, they were originally from India. And when European ships docked in Indian ports, the subcontinent of India, oftentimes these rats would climb on the ship or climb up the ship's rope and stow away in the hulls of the ship where all the grain was or where all the food stuff was. And then when those ships docked back in London or Paris or Rome, as the ships sit there, the rats would debark and they would begin to populate these European cities. And these European rats, these Indian rats that were now European rats, the black rat, with this particular susceptible virus in their system, immediately began to infect all of Europe in the 14th century. That's the high period of the Black Death, but people forget that the plague was an ongoing thing from the 1300s all the way into the early 1700s. In fact, perhaps outside of the 14th century, perhaps the most devastating plague in London took place in 1665, the Great Plague of London, which happened well after Shakespeare's death. And here we have an image, the bubonic plague, of fleas living on rats. It struck London in very virulent form in 1563, 1578, and 1579. 1582 was a bad plague year. 1592 and 93 was a horrible plague year. In fact, in 1592, the theaters all across London were closed. Shakespeare's theater was closed because of the plague. People couldn't go. The one thing you didn't want to have during a plague is people congregating together in public places to be together. And everybody went to see the play, so they had to close the theaters down in 1592, in 1603, and again from 1608 to about 1610, the theaters had to be closed down because it was absolutely too dangerous. And at these times during the Shakespeare's career, Shakespeare's literary career began about 1590-91 and ended about 1613. So you can see 1592, 93, 1603, 1608 to 1610. This is right in the heart of Shakespeare's career. And so dealing with this, you could see in our image here, you have an actual image of a Renaissance plague doctor. This is what would come to, if when you got sick of the plague, you were fortunate to have a doctor come visit you, this is what you would be likely to see. These long foreboding gowns, the hats, and then the bird-like, beak-like masks that they would wear as an effort, not understanding anything about biology back then. They didn't know that it was rats. They didn't know that the plague was transmitted by rats. They didn't know that the sickness was, the ways that the sickness was contagious. And they didn't know whether you breathed it in or whether it was something in the air. Was it something weather-related? And so they took these really extreme precautions. Now, there's nothing that this plague doctor is wearing that would necessarily stop him from being infected. The eyes are open. There's places for the eye, the infection to come in through the eyes, get on the hands, and then be transferred. But that's the kind of thing it's very surreal when you think about it, how they had to try to deal with these things. These outbreaks, particularly in 1563, the year before Shakespeare was born, and 1603, decimated over 25% of London's inhabitants. Think about that. Think about 25% of everybody you know being dead within a space of about a month. And that routinely happened in London, where you had, again, the cramped quarters, the poor hygiene, and the complete ignorance about what it was. As a matter, give you an example. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, the office of the dog catcher, right? That fanciful office of the dog catcher. Some elected official whose job it is to go out and round up stray dogs and cats. Well, the dog catcher was invented in medieval and Renaissance culture primarily to round up all the stray animals because they thought that maybe these stray dogs and cats were what were spreading the disease. So the dog catcher would go around and round up all these strays and get rid of them, kill them, dispose of them, in the hopes that by getting rid of these stray dogs and cats that you were eliminating one of the vectors that spread the plague. And what an irony. It was dogs and cats that ate rats. So by getting rid of the dogs and cats, you were guaranteeing more fleas and more rats. And this shows you the sort of vagaries of trying to survive in a world where we didn't have any understanding fundamentally of how this worked. Besides the plague, the next perhaps most terrible visitation of sickness in Shakespeare's world would have been smallpox. It's a pretty gruesome picture. It's from a movie about Queen Elizabeth. There was a terrible outbreak of smallpox in 1562, and we know from reading Victorian novels, right, that smallpox, well into the 20th century, smallpox epidemics just ran wild before we began to get the epidemiology down. Queen Elizabeth herself, the 29-year-old Queen Elizabeth, despite all of her doctors, despite all of her relative isolation, the precaution taken by her ministers to keep her separate from those who were ill, she caught smallpox in 1562 at the age of 29. And it was reputedly so scarred her face. That was, for those lucky few who survived the smallpox, you could expect to have tremendous scarring from the pox itself. And the argument is that one of the reasons that we see Elizabeth so made up, it's sort of traditional to see her made up very patently in white, exaggerated white, and some of that's fashion for the day, but in this particular image, I think you get a sense of it. It was another reason to cover up the pox scars, the scars from the poxing, the scars, the pits that came from the disease that she managed to survive. Interestingly, one of the major waiting women, a gentlewoman of the court who waited on Elizabeth in her sickness, she became sick herself and became so scarred by the disease that she never set foot at court or in public again. So besides the plague, besides smallpox, we have syphilis. We are very familiar today with antibiotics, and a sexually transmitted disease, a venereal disease like syphilis, we can more or less take care of with an antibiotic shot. But in the 16th century, they clearly didn't understand that. And it's an interesting historical fact that syphilis is primarily a disease, we believe now, that was prevalent in Native American populations. In fact, we are pretty sure that it was Christopher Columbus himself who brought syphilis back to Europe. Now, as far as we can tell, the syphilis that was occupying Native American bodies and Native American culture, it it must have been something that the natives had gotten used to over thousands and thousands of years. They must have developed naturally some sort of a resistance to it built up over the centuries. But when Europeans encountered syphilis for the first time, when Europeans engaged in sexual acts with Native American women and picked up this disease, it completely ravaged Europe. When they brought the disease back to Europe, it was horribly, horribly traumatic. There was no way to cure it. And syphilis, if left unattended, is highly deadly. The symptoms of syphilis are raging high fever, ultimate blindness, very much like the plague in some degree. You would get pus-filled sores all over the body, nodules, absolute insanity as everything in the head sort of liquefied, heart valve leakage, ultimately meningitis and death. In fact, one of the famous doctors of the period, Dr. William Close, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, wrote in 1585, wrote a tract on syphilis, trying to understand it, and called the victims of syphilis, quote, an infinite multitude. And he had no place. There was no place in London that could accommodate the number of people. This is an actual picture of a 19th century, early 19th century skull. It's a drawing of the skull of a woman who died of syphilis, and you can see what it does. It hollows out the sinus cavities. It literally made the nose fall off. It turned the contents of the brain into, it liquefied it in a way as the final stages of death set in. Really horrible, and there was no way to treat it. In fact, one of the treatments in Shakespeare, and Shakespeare writes about this in his plays all over the place. In the comedies, he jokes about it. In the tragedies, he uses it as a metaphor. Even think about Romeo and Juliet, that famous line, "A pox upon your houses," right? Where it's said to the warring two families in Romeo and Juliet, right? Another character says, well, a pox upon both your houses. I mean, literally wishing upon them the pox in this regard. Pox being sometimes a word used to express syphilis, other times a word used to express the smallpox. The savagery of what these diseases did. In Shakespeare's day, they didn't know how to treat it, and so they tried to treat, they figured they would treat syphilitic people by having them bathe in mercury. And if you know anything about the chemical mercury, it's going to scald and burn you. It's very, very caustic. And they didn't know any better, so people would actually take what was called the tub cure, the tub. You would get in a tub, a doctor would put a tub out there with mercury in it, and you would bathe in that. And of course, the mercury would so scar your genitalia that the burn, the caustic nature of it, made you feel as if, it's like kind of like cauterizing a wound, made you feel as if the infection had been stopped. But what they didn't know is the infection was internal. So simply treating the outside topical part of the anatomy that was infected wasn't going to do anything. So on top of lingering and dying with this horrible disease, you also paid the price. The treatment was in some ways as bad or worse than the cure. So all these things then form the backdrop. And we're going to talk about all of them because, like I said, we're going to emphasize throughout our study of Shakespeare for the next 4 episodes. We're going to emphasize Shakespeare's reaction to this, his culture's reaction to this. What do you do? We've been fortunate, certainly in the modern world, we've been fortunate in the Western world not to have to really live through these kinds of epidemics. I mean, you remember the scare of Ebola a few years ago and the tremendous worry that they weren't going to be able to contain that in places like Africa and that it was beginning to perhaps spread. Now we've got things like Zika, right, which are beginning to scare people, and the damage that that's doing, particularly to pregnant mothers. And so we don't really have any understanding of this kind of plague. And so in the backdrop of all of that, let's take a look at Shakespeare's biography, and you're going to see that Shakespeare's own life began and ended with having to accommodate death, the death of siblings, the death of friends, sickness at every corner. In 1564, William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon to Tanner, John, and Mary Shakespeare. His birthday is celebrated today on April 23rd. Now, we don't know for sure when Shakespeare was born, but we do know for a fact that Shakespeare was baptized on 26 April in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. And it was very customary in Protestant countries, in England at the time, to baptize babies 3 days after they were born. There's Holy Trinity, which you can go to today. It's a beautiful old church. The trust there that looks after the grounds is really quite good. That's the interior of the cathedral there. And those plaques along the bottom part of the image are gravestones. Those are the headstones. The bodies were buried right under the floor, right before the altar. And the one on the far left is actually Shakespeare's tomb. The one by the arch there is Shakespeare's tomb. Underneath that floorboard, Shakespeare is buried. What do we know about it? I mentioned before that one of the problems with Shakespearean biography is we know so much about where he was, he's mentioned a lot in his plays. We have lots of legal documents pertaining to Shakespeare. When he got his coat of arms, his people who sued him, and people who he sued. We have Shakespeare's will. We have all sorts of day-to-day little records of Shakespeare engaging in transactions. This is his grammar school here, 1571. But we have all this minutia evidence about Shakespeare. We know kind of a lot about him, but we know nothing about his personality. We know nothing about what he was doing at key events during his life. We have nothing. He's so enigmatic except for these little snippets here and there across his life. And because of that, because of the paucity of serious knowledge about who he was, how he interrelated with people, what his ethos was, it's very tempting for modern scholars to suggest that Shakespeare was a myth, or that other people used Shakespeare as a pseudonym to create his plays. Everybody from Queen Elizabeth to Christopher Marlowe to the 17th Earl of Oxford de Vere, and many, 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 many more candidates have been put forth as the author of Shakespeare's plays, and they've been put forth primarily for one reason. Shakespeare didn't go to university. My personal view is that it's terribly elitist. This idea that Shakespeare didn't attend the university, so therefore he couldn't have had the insight or the talent that he had. And not surprisingly, it's primarily university professor types who will argue that Shakespeare's lack of a college education disqualified him from this kind of genius. But we know, we have much evidence from other geniuses that people like Mozart were writing symphonies in their relative infancy. So genius is genius. We have so much evidence about Shakespeare the man, not the kind of evidence we'd like to have. We don't have a direct correlation to some of the emotional, intellectual, and familial things that he did. But we do know this, that by 1571, the 7-year-old William probably began his formal education, given that his father had achieved a certain status in the society of Stratford-upon-Avon. At one point, he would reach the level, John Shakespeare, of the equivalent of mayor of the town of Stratford. By 1571, by all accounts, Shakespeare most likely would have received a grammar school education at King's New School, which would be the Stratford Grammar School in the area there. Now, when we say grammar school, we're tempted to suggest that it seems to give us the impression that Shakespeare had nothing but an elementary education. But also keep in mind that relatively very, very few Elizabethan children ever went to school at all. Only the more elite kids got to go. And a grammar school in Shakespeare's day would have been a really intense education, something equivalent to a high school education in many ways, or beyond what we give our kids. That at this grammar school, Shakespeare would have became absolutely conversant with Latin, possibly studied some Greek. He would have been absolutely schooled in classical models. He would have read the ancient texts. Many of the ancient allusions, the classical allusions, the biblical allusions that appear all throughout Shakespeare's work, he absolutely would have been exposed to in a good grammar school like this one at 7 years old. And in 1575, when young William was 11 years old, this is a cause for a lot of speculation. There's one of the more famous portraits of Elizabeth, and you can see her all bedecked as queen, and in this instance, empress, because you can see that the queen stands upon a map of Europe to signify just how far her dominion as English queen spread, her influence, her relations, those nations that were under the immediate sway of England. And notice, too, the face. Again, the very high tufted wig, the completely whitewashed face. Some of that was fashion. Some of that was designed to give her an ethereal quality, a spiritual quality, and as many have speculated, to also hide perhaps those smallpox scars. In 1575, when William was 11 years old, Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth visited Kenilworth Castle, very near Stratford, where he was born. It's really tempting, and many people have speculated, that perhaps the 11-year-old William Shakespeare saw the Queen's elaborate procession and recreated it in many of his royal tragedies or royal history plays. Whenever queens went on progress, kings or queens went on progress, They always had weeks and weeks of feasting and parties and masks and dances, all sorts of entertainments that the local people put on to impress, to delight, to flatter their queen. And one wonders if the 11-year-old Shakespeare, at that visit to Kenilworth, got to be, and given the relative prominence of his father, wonder if young Shakespeare got to get his first taste of the dramatic life, of masking and playmaking and speechifying and rhetoric that may have just spurred his young imagination. Some salient dates. In 1582, the 18-year-old William Shakespeare married the 26-year-old Anne Hathaway, a much older woman given the mores of the time. It was more customary for older men to marry younger women, but in this case, 18-year-old Shakespeare married the 26-year-old Anne Hathaway in relative haste, and we now know why. By 1583, 5 months after their marriage, Shakespeare had a daughter named Susanna, born five months after the wedding, which means the child was conceived out of wedlock. The marriage was a marriage of necessity. By 1585, Shakespeare had 2 other children. He only had 3. And in 1585, Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway had twins, Judith and Hamnet. And if that name sounds familiar, you're right. In Elizabethan parlance, Hamnet and Hamlet would have been interchangeable names. And there's no doubt there was a good friend of Shakespeare's who he remembered in his will, a fellow by the name of Hamlet Sadler. So Shakespeare was very conversant with that name. The play Hamlet, the idea of a play Hamlet, really pre-exists this. Shakespeare's rewriting an older version of a play named the Hamlet. But that name that he gave one of his twins. Now this becomes more intriguing. Everything I just told you about birthdays, about siblings, about children, about relationships with his parents, about Kenilworth Castle visit, we would gladly, as academics and scholars, we would gladly trade all that information. We'd give it up if we could just find out what Shakespeare was doing between those years. Between 1585 and the birth of his twins and 1592, we really don't know what he was doing. This has just frustrated people to no end. We know that about 1591-92, he is in London, he is writing plays. He's apparently left his family behind in Stratford. He's left his 3 babies, and he has somehow found his way to London, where he becomes part of a theater troupe, where he's going to spend almost all the rest of his life, sort of divorced, separated from his family. And we don't know what he did during 1585 and 1592. There's speculation. Did he go to the theater early? Did he apprentice in the London theaters? Did he get used to London life? One of the more intriguing speculations. Shakespeare's plays are so conversant with the continent. Did Shakespeare spend some time in Europe? Plays like The 2 Gentlemen of Verona or The Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare clearly had wrote a number of plays in an Italian setting or in French settings. All's well that ends well. And so again and again and again, you know, Shakespeare's seeming familiarity with European travel and setting his plays in these European settings, these continental European settings, makes people wonder if a child of privilege like Shakespeare more or less would have taken the tour, as so many English kids did, who had money, who had some influence. Go to Europe, learn some languages, take your holiday there, pick up the mores and the customs, diversify your experience, right? Shakespeare says the same thing in the Taming of the Shrew, right? Where 2 characters show up in an Italian city to seek experience far away from home, where small experience grows, right? That there's only so much you can learn at the local Stratford and Avon 5 and dime. To experience the world, you had to hit Italy, you had to hit France. So we don't know what he did there. But right away we see the impingement of this. By 1596, little Hamnet Shakespeare died. 11-year-old Hamnet died, probably of the plague, a particularly bad episode of the plague. Shakespeare's father, also during that very same year, was granted a coat of arms. This is an interesting thing. By the time the 1590s rolled around, John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father, had fallen out of favor. We have all sorts of records of debt, of what we would today call a kind of bankruptcy. He seems to have gotten himself made some bad investments. And so likely, Shakespeare's father, John, could not have applied to a coat of arms. A coat of arms would have conferred gentlemanship, a gentleman status, on whoever received it. And John was in no position financially to be able to apply for or pay for that. It cost Shakespeare about the equivalent, we assume then, that his son, William, was the one who fronted the money. And it cost Shakespeare about $15,000 in today's money to buy a coat of arms to recognize the family in gentlemanly style. And by 1597, obviously 1 year later, Shakespeare is doing quite well, because William Shakespeare buys the famous New Place in Stratford-upon-Avon. There's a picture of it. It's there today, which was one of the biggest, most opulent houses, Tudor houses, in all of the community there. And Shakespeare bought the biggest house in town and would ultimately, at the end of his career, return back here to become a gentleman farmer. By 1601, Shakespeare's father is dead. By 1608, his mother is dead. And by 1616, Shakespeare dies. Now, this is a compelling argument. We've got there that first picture on the top, the scrawling handwriting. That's William Shakespeare's signature on his will. Sometime a month or so before he died, Shakespeare sat down and wrote his will. Well, he had written it a few months earlier and then amended it a month before he died. It seems obvious. And if you look at the will there, you can't get a great picture, but you can see the handwriting. If you look at the will, you can see places where things are crossed out. So a couple months before he died, Shakespeare got to work revising his will, updating his affairs. And then 1 month before he died, he revised it again. And you can see the handwriting there. A little bit shaky, right? One wonders if he had a bit of palsy. One wondered if his hand was unsteady. All right. He had retired from the theater by about 1613. After about 1613, Shakespeare moved back to Stratford-upon-Avon. He more or less gave up life in the theater as far as we can tell, and he became a gentleman farmer. He retired to his new place, his manor, his mansion, and apparently lived out the end of his days. Now, was he sick? Was it at the beginning of an illness that caused him to retire and leave the beloved theater? Was he tired of it all? We don't know. But certainly, you can see in the deterioration of the will and the handwriting in the will, one of the authentic signatures of Shakespeare. And interestingly, when Shakespeare was buried under the floor of Stratford-upon-Avon, we saw the church, we saw that altar, and we saw those stones. Shakespeare's headstone, flagstone here, actually has a curse, a blessing and a curse written upon it. And it reads, you can barely make it out there, but it reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones." Right? Leave it to Shakespeare, right? Whose whole career, the great plays, whether the comic plays or the tragic plays, certainly the history plays, just some of the most, and we'll look at them moving forward, some of the most absolutely amazing reflections on mortality, reflections on death, reflections on the fragile nature of the human condition, reflections on what happens to us when we are dead, the physical processes of decay and destruction and rot, the symbolism of death. I mean, the unforgettable image of Hamlet with the skull of Yorick, his friend when he was a little boy in Denmark and Elsinore Castle. That moment where Hamlet is handed the skull of the king's jester who used to amuse him as a child. These reflections on mortality that we will look at in the subsequent weeks. Powerful stuff. And this little bit of doggerel written on his tombstone. "Good friend, don't dig here. Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed is that man who spares these stones, and cursed is he who moves my bones." So you can be blessed by leaving him alone, and cursed if you seek to move his bones. And it's really quite interesting. In 400 years, exactly 400 years, as far as we know, there's never been an excavation of the tomb. Arguably the most famous artist in the history of the world, and we have not disturbed that headstone to see what's inside. We know that radiographic images have been taken just this very year, as a matter of fact. Earlier in the year, they brought high-quality radiographic instruments into the church, and they shot rays through the stone to see what was in the tomb. And what they found was largely an empty tomb, which isn't surprising. After 400 years, it's pretty likely that any body that had been in that tomb, given the way they buried them, would have been consigned to dust, right? And so the idea that we found, we could see nothing radiographically, which isn't the best way to look anyway, isn't necessarily surprising. But one thing that did happen when they did these radiographic images of the tomb is they found that at the head end of the vault, at the top end of the vault where the head would have been, the radiographic analysis found that the tomb had been That part of the tomb seems to have been knocked down at some point and then rebuilt in a different manner than the original tomb, which suggests that maybe at some point over the last 400 years, somebody did enter that tomb, no doubt illegally. And so we actually have a magazine article dating from the late 19th century, about 1879, a magazine article from Victorian England that makes the claim that almost 100 years earlier, somebody had broken into Shakespeare's tomb and stolen a skull. The idea that you would take a skull as a memento, as a reminder, particularly the skull of a great or important person. This happened many, many times throughout history, certainly in Europe throughout history. This idea that possessing a body part of somebody as famous and legendary as Shakespeare would be a very treasured thing to have. And what a remarkable irony that would be, right? For the poet who wrote so eloquently about the skull of Yorick in Hamlet's hand, having his own skull taken from the tomb. And if that did happen, it certainly would have been done in an unsanctioned way. Somebody would have robbed the grave to take that precious memento with them, maybe to set it on their study as a reminder of human mortality. So even in death, Shakespeare's own body becomes a bit of a controversial thing. The curse on his tomb tells us much about who he was. It tells us much about what his fears were. We understand that the man who, now we don't know for sure Shakespeare wrote it, but when you look at we have every reason to believe he did, given the way he approached death in his own plays. And so this warning on his tomb, right? Whatever else you do, leave me alone. I mean, you think about this. Given the religious attitude, the theology of the day, Protestant Englishmen of the 16th century absolutely believed in the resurrection of the body. I mean, these are theological tenets we hold dear today as Christians, that one day the body was going to have to get up from the grave and be rejoined with the soul. Now, think about the metaphysical images that are associated with that. It raised all sorts of anxieties for Elizabethan people. For instance, what happens if you have a leg blown off in war? I mean, and the leg is buried somewhere in France where you were fighting, and the rest of your body is buried in Europe. In England? Are you going to have to, on that last day? These are questions that they asked themselves, that they debated in the theological tracts. Are you going to have to get up on the last day from your English grave and sort of hop on one leg across the channel to get your bones? And what about your hair? All the hair you'd grow and the fingernails, these are part of your corporeal body. I mean, are you going to have to assemble all those things at the last day? What was it that was going to get up from the grave with you? And you think about how, and we're going to look at them very carefully over the next weeks, but you think about how many of Shakespeare's plays deal with fragmentation, deal with body parts, deal with decay, deal with rot. Much graveyard talk, much gallows humor, bodies being rent asunder and torn. This idea that occupied them so dearly of the metaphysical state of the body. If the body is indeed made in the image of God, how do you bury it? What do you do with it? And what are the consequences of burning it, reducing it to ashes? What happens to bodies that aren't given proper Christian burial? Bodies, for instance, that were lost at sea during shipwrecks and drownings. Metaphysically, how is that negotiated? And in Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare was such a sensitive register of culture. I mean, I've never read another author quite like him in his ability to sort of pick up the scent of what's in the air. There are a number of contemporary poets, by the way, who do exactly what Shakespeare does. You think about the drama of the English Renaissance, Elizabethan revenge tragedy, for instance, all about this, all about bodies being rent and torn and sundered in various ways, about bodies that get up from the grave, about souls that can't rest, that come back as ghosts. Think of most famously great Caesar's ghost from Julius Caesar, right? Who Caesar's ghost comes back to torment Brutus on the eve of his own death, the murderer of Caesar. And so you see these metaphysical issues back and forth. Shakespeare is a tremendously sensitive register of those things. So it's not surprising that besides the theological conflict between Protestant and Catholic, which we see in the plays, besides the images of disease, the image of plagues and diseases, we see them across the plays as well. And syphilis. In the romantic comedies, Shakespeare's always making wisecracks about syphilis. Plays like Measure for Measure, for instance, the comedy is steeped in people who have gotten themselves sick with syphilis. So you see moving across the plays all of these sociological, epidemiological, all of these cultural issues that subsume them. They become the grist for the mill of Shakespeare's play. And it's just remarkable that in his own death, Shakespeare is concerned about the state of his body after death. The great contemporary of Shakespeare, the Protestant divine, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, John Donne, the famous author of such poems as, you may remember the opening lines, "No man is an island entire of itself," right? That John Donne. He too was absolutely fixated on bodies. He was terribly worried that when he died, his parts were going to scatter a little bit, which would make it hard to reassemble him. And much of his great poetry reflects on the philosophical and the metaphysical consequences of deconstruction, of decomposition, and how we fix it all together. When Jesus says, "Good friend, forbear to dig the dust and close it here, leave me be," it is a remarkably earnest plea from a poet who wrote so eloquently himself about these things. Don't dig this grave. And in a remarkable instance of restraint, for hundreds of years now, the trustees of Avon Church there, the Holy Trinity Church in Avon, Stratford, they absolutely refuse to have the tomb moved, excavated in any way, shape, or form, disturbed. They have been tremendous caretakers of this, in part because it is the will, the legacy of Shakespeare. But in an age like ours, which could do so much with forensics, which could make so many interesting observations and revelations by going into the tomb and seeing what's there. They have refused to desecrate that tomb. I think Shakespeare would be remarkably pleased by that. And we're going to see, as we move forward in our study of Shakespeare, just how profoundly death and disease was emphasized in his own life and his own plays. But remember, too, that by the time we get to our last segment, Shakespeare being a clear Christian, we actually have one of the Bibles that we knew Shakespeare used. We own one of his personal Bibles, his Geneva Bible, a very sort of militantly Protestant Bible that he used. And we have his handwriting in it, and we have in sepia brown ink all sorts of underlines throughout his personal copy of the Bible, of verses that struck him, of parables and psalms that meant a lot to him, of prayers and of narrations that really moved him. And it's interesting that a lot of the ones that he underlined make their appearances in his plays. So at the end of it all, what was the one thing that was going to preserve him, or any Elizabethan, from dissolution? The problem of Shakespeare's world, the problem of the Renaissance, whether it's the Italian Renaissance and Michelangelo, who also, as we know, Michelangelo, who died the year he was born, was terribly worried about this too. He was terribly worried, Michelangelo, in his sonnet sequence, his poems. He was terribly worried about dissolution, falling apart. You may remember in the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment panel on the west wall. If you remember that image, you've got St. Bartholomew. And St. Bartholomew, who was martyred by being flayed, having his skin removed from his body. There's that great picture, St. Bartholomew, the resurrected St. Bartholomew ascending to heaven on the last day. He has draped over his arm his own skin, his own flayed skin. And the face, the crumpled face on that skin, is the face of Michelangelo. These kind of somatic, by somatic, but we mean bodily, these kind of somatic fears just are all throughout the age, and they're really fascinating. So for Shakespeare, however, as a good, same thing with John Donne, as a good Christian, the only thing that could defeat this dissolution was resurrection and salvation. Sir Walter Raleigh, you may remember, Raleigh, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, had his head cut off by King James. And Raleigh wrote a nice little poem before he died in which he said that he trusted that from this earth and dust, the Lord would raise him up. He trusted, right? This idea that on the eve of his own beheading, when the head was going to be separated from the body, Raleigh's last little poem was a prayer that he'll get up again. And so in the last segment of our overview, we're going to look very carefully at how Shakespeare takes issues of death and transmutes them into beauty, into eternity, into immortality. And one of the ways he does that is through his art. The power of art, of verse, of poetry, to convey a sense of the soul, the person who wrote it, down through the ages. And certainly 400 years after his death, he is as popular as he's ever been. A little brief comment as we get ourselves wound up here. We've looked at his biography. Let's look at his career briefly. This is the 1623 First Folio. 1623, 7 years after William Shakespeare died, is also the very year that his collective plays were put together in one place, this First Folio, and it's also the year that Shakespeare's widow Anne dies. And this is remarkable to think about. Shakespeare, we have this conception of the modern artist. We have this conception today that the modern artist is, it's kind of that romantic 18th century notion of shaggy-haired poets like Byron, sitting in a garret somewhere with one of those wonderful lacy Elizabethan shirts with the laces strung open, right? Sitting there by candlelight, agonizing over their muse, right? Suffering for their art, giving up their whole lives for their art. Well, that's not Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a poet and a playwright. He was very conscious of his craft, but there seems to be absolutely no evidence that Shakespeare lived that kind of a life. In the 16th century, unlike later in the era of the Romantic poets, Shakespeare's world was not big on publishing. There was really no money to be made by an author for writing books in this regard. So when Shakespeare wrote his plays, he didn't write them with a mind to saving them. He didn't write them with a mind that he would put the play on and then publish them, because there was really no money in that. So when Shakespeare wrote his manuscripts, and by all accounts, Shakespeare wrote 37 plays, 154 sonnets, 2 non-dramatic poems and an elegy, and there's a couple other poems that people think were Shakespeare's. It's a pretty remarkable, when you figure that his career began about 1592 and ended about 1613, right? We're talking a little over 20 years, 21 years or 21 years or so in the theater. We're talking about almost 2 plays a year, plus these other poems and plus the other things he did. And keep in mind that not only was Shakespeare a playwright for the company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men was his company's name, because the Lord Chamberlain of England, arguably the single most important person in England, not named the King or the Queen, the Lord Chamberlain of England sponsored Shakespeare's theater troupe because they recognized the Elizabethan government, just what a gem this was. And after, by the way, the Lord Chamberlain died, after Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, who patronized many of his plays, Midsummer Night, the very year she died, 1603, A Midsummer Night's Dream was performed before Queen Elizabeth, and she died a few months after that. And the new king, the king that replaced Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, of course, was the Virgin Queen. She had no children. And so when she died, there was nobody to leave the kingdom to. Her next nearest royal relative was King James VI of Scotland. King James came down from Scotland to become King James I of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. So James came down in 1603, became the king, and he was such a lover of drama and such a lover of Shakespearean drama that he himself, not the Chamberlain, he himself became the patron of Shakespeare in 1603, and they renamed Shakespeare the King's Men. So, I mean, no higher honor could be paid. That Shakespeare, his play company, his troupe, they were absolutely sponsored and promoted by no less a figure than the king himself. In 1599, the Globe Theater opened, which you all know, right? The famous Globe Theater was opened in 1599, where Shakespeare would perform his plays. And so what happened was at the end of this wonderful ride that Shakespeare had, he died in 1616, and another reason why people want to speculate that maybe Shakespeare didn't write his plays. He died in 1616, and he really doesn't mention them in his will. That strikes us as odd. I mean, if we had something as valuable, if we had created something as brilliant as Shakespeare's plays, we certainly would have mentioned it, and we'd have boasted about it in our will, but he didn't. And that's not because he didn't write his plays. It's because once he had written them, they were written to be performed. He wrote a script, he wrote a manuscript, then he took it to the theater, and secretaries, scribes, would take his manuscript and copy it out a number of times, 10, 12 times, so that a number of the players in the play had a copy. And that was it. Once the play was performed, the actors had memorized their scripts. There was no real reason for Shakespeare to save or to keep them or to collate them. And if it weren't for the 1623 First Folio, with the picture we have here, the First Folio of 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare died, 2 of his friends, Hemages and Condell, 2 friends who were actors in his plays, They came together, they found whatever scraps of manuscripts they could find, whatever leftover script versions they could find from all these plays for all those years in drawers, or they collected them from actors. They found any they could, and they cobbled them together, and they put them together in the book, right? And that's Shakespeare's First Folio, one of the most famous books in the world. 7 years after he died, his two actor friends conveyed a kind of immortality on him that lasts to this day, an immortality that transcends death, decay, and whatever it is that lies beneath that tombstone in Stratford. So when I see you next, we're going to take a good, long, hard look of exactly what Shakespeare writes, says, and thinks about death in all its facets next time.